I would now like to go ahead and introduce our featured speaker, Gunjan Bagla, whose latest article about global markets appears on the Harvard Business Review this very morning. Founder and managing director of Amritt in California, Gunjan is trusted by senior corporate executives at large and mid-sized companies in America and Europe when it comes to doing business in India. Gunjan's clients include companies in energy, infrastructure, consumer goods, manufacturing, software, technology, medical devices, and more. He was the only Southern California executive to be part of President Obama's executive mission to India and has appeared on Bloomberg TV, BBC TV, the New York Times, and the Financial Times as the India expert. Gunjan is a mechanical engineer from the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur and has an MBA with honors from Southern Illinois University. Without further ado, here's Gunjan.
Thank you, Supriya, and welcome to all of you who have joined in. I checked this morning and we have a large number of registrants from Europe and India and Canada, in addition to representatives from at least 20 to 22 American states. So welcome to all of you. We will keep this at a fairly quick pace, and I do encourage you to send me questions using the question box in the applet on your screen, and this way we can keep the webinar interactive. So just a few days ago, the Cooper Tire and Rubber Company of Ohio announced that it had agreed to an acquisition. It's the second largest tire company in the US, next only to Goodyear. And the interesting piece of news from our perspective on this call was that the buyer happens to be one of India's largest automotive companies called Apollo Tyres Limited, based in Chennai in southern India. The deal is supposed to close later this year. It seems to have cleared US regulators, and so there's just a few other steps that will happen before the Cooper Tire Company becomes a subsidiary of Apollo. And I just bring this to your attention. It happened without much fanfare and without much controversy. As Indian acquirers are becoming active in the US, they are being accepted perhaps a little more readily than acquirers from another Asian country that I'm sure you're all aware of. So today we are going to do a quick overview and then jump into the specific aspects of marketing applied to India in an effort to help you figure out how to boost your sales there. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about some markers for success in India. We have most of our registrants online already, so I want to start by finding out a little bit about you. Okay, I am going to run the first of our interactive polls. You should see before you on your screen the question about which emerging markets are important to you. If you can take a moment to answer that, I would really appreciate it. Let me close the poll and share the results with everybody. So not surprisingly, about 60% of you are interested in India, and that would make sense given the topic of the webinar. The number of people interested in China is a little smaller than we have seen in the past, and this is probably a reflection of the maturity of the Chinese market for many of you. And then a small percentage of you are interested in Brazil and Southeast Asia. Let me hide the poll and move on. So there's almost a gold rush a few months ago, and I visited the Starbucks coffee shop in Goregaon in northern Mumbai, and that's the picture you see. It looks very much recognizably like a Starbucks in the US. And on the left, you can see the sign with the Starbucks siren and the word Starbucks written in Hindi. It is actually an alliance with an Indian company, and Starbucks waited a long while before they entered India, and I'll talk a little bit more about that perhaps later. The Economist carried a very interesting article early this year, and I've got one of the key graphs from it that I want to show you. And they looked at foreign companies operating in India and the percentage of their market value that is ascribed to the Indian operation. They also looked at the absolute market value of the Indian business. And you will see that most of the top companies are either European or Japanese. So British American Tobacco actually owns a big chunk of ITC, which is India's company in both the cigarette, the hotel, and the fishing business, believe it or not. And that represents 44% of British American Tobacco's value. Those are the numbers shown over here. And that's about $40 billion. Unilever, which is India's largest consumer products company, Hindustan Unilever Limited, is shown here at about $20 billion and 15% of value. That's actually gone up because Unilever Corporate spent a couple of $1 billion to buy out another 15 or 20% of its Indian unit. And so these numbers have gone up since. The first American company that you see on the list is way down there, Cummins India, which makes engines. They used to have a collaboration, and now they have their own unit. They've done remarkably well in India. We won't be talking about Cummins in this particular webinar, but I do encourage you to take a look at their success in India. They're one of the remarkable stories of an American company becoming successful. Now, my expectation is that if The Economist runs this graph again in 5 years from now, there will be far more American companies at or near the top of this list. And that's something that we should all be watching for and celebrating. You might ask, why should I really care about India at this moment? So I want to give you some recent and current news. Just a few weeks ago, Dr. Jill Biden and her husband, Vice President Joe Biden, spent almost a full week in India. He was in Delhi. And then they went on to Mumbai, and they spoke. He spoke at the Bombay Stock Exchange. One of the interesting things that he said was that while U.S.-India trade has increased rapidly in recent years to $100 billion, he foresees a scenario where the two countries could be transacting $500 billion of trade or bilateral trade between each other. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article for Business Week that essentially echoed that said the same kind of thing, and I think this realization has come upon mid-sized and large American companies that there's a tremendous potential for the Indian market to expand way beyond what it is today. Some of this is driven by the GDP growth of India, which is running somewhere between 5 and 9%, and lately between 6 and 8%. India this year has opened up much more to foreign direct investment. It is already the third largest recipient of foreign direct investment worldwide, next only to the United States, followed by China. This is data taken from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Just a few weeks ago, the Indian government decided to liberalize investment in telecom to allow 100% investment from a foreign company in the telecom sector. A few months ago, they had enabled companies such as Walmart and IKEA to participate in India by opening up what they call multi-brand retail to up to 51% foreign investment. Just a couple of weeks ago, I think actually earlier in August, the government announced some regulatory changes that makes it easier for the Walmarts to actually invest that 51% and get to market in India. One other factor when you look at the so-called BRIC countries, Russia, China, Brazil, and India, India stands out in being the most American-friendly of those societies. And this is confirmed by surveys that the Pew Center conducts, as well as those conducted by Ipsos, the market research firm. Indians generally have a very positive attitude towards America and towards Americans. It is also a democracy, unlike China, and it maintains a very vigorous free press. So many of the societal institutions that you and I are used to in the United States are visible within India. And so it makes it a good place to do business. And as a result, American companies, although they got a later start than the Europeans, are winning today. The year 2013, I think, is crucial because the decisions you make now will affect the future of your companies, as well as your future as within your corporations, your corporate career, I would say. This has been borne out by those who have come to us in the last 3 to 5 years and have taken on the banner of supporting India sales and other efforts, and we find generally that they have done well in their careers. They've been promoted. Some of them have taken on expat locations in India or in Singapore, and they have done extremely well. Let me give you my stab of the top sectors that are active in India. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and the numbers do not represent a ranking. There's money to be made everywhere in India, and these are just our indications of, by our judgment of our client activity, as well as the things that we see happening to companies that may not be our client. One of the things that people in the US don't realize is that there is a huge manufacturing boom going on in India. Most Americans are aware of Chinese manufacturing booming, and much of that is driven by factories in China that produce for the American market. Whereas only 28% of the Indian economy depends on exports. So the boom in Indian manufacturing is really catering to domestic demand. And I'm talking about this as a market where if your company supplies products that go into the manufacturing infrastructure, whether they are machine tools, whether it's packaging, whether it's products that are used by manufacturers, there's a tremendous demand for all of those components, subsystems, factory planning services, packaging, machinery, you name it. Okay. Any company who is in that kind of business should be looking very closely at how they can find a market in India. Another big factor that is driving growth in India is the Indian government's commitment to vastly improve its infrastructure. Over the next decade, India is going to spend $1 trillion to upgrade its infrastructure, whether it be roads, bridges, highways, tunnels, ports, you name it. About 2/3 of this money is going to come from India, from government and private investments and partnerships and money raised on the capital markets, and they expect 1/3 of it will come from foreign collaboration or from World Bank loans. India is the largest borrower from the World Bank and one of the largest borrowers from the Asian Development Bank, and they are also the one big country that has always paid back its debt on time. So the World Bank absolutely loves India for that. The one big challenge in India is energy. They don't have enough of it, and they need every possible kind of energy. So if you are in the overall energy sector, whether you can help with solar energy or wind, if you can help with coal, particularly clean coal, if you are participating in the nuclear energy ecosystem, or you have technologies and products and services that support the transmission and distribution of electricity through smart grid and other applications, you will find a welcoming market in India. Now, there are complications with that kind of market, of course, because you're selling to governments, sometimes state governments and the federal government. Sometimes you're selling to the private sector, but it is absolutely an irresistible market if you're in the energy sector. Let's talk briefly about aerospace and defense. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute publishes a study every other year talking about the biggest importers of weapons and equipment, and India has been at the top of that list in recent years. Much of their purchases used to be from Europe, and that has now changed, as you will see on the next slide in a moment. With over 1 billion people and a very rapidly growing middle class, healthcare in India is booming today. People have more money to spend, lifestyle diseases are increasing, and the government is spending a greater percentage of GDP on healthcare. Private insurance is starting to become a factor, and all of this means that if you're a medical device company, if you are in the pharma or biotech business, and perhaps if you want to set up clinics or hospitals, you should be looking very closely at the Indian market. There are numerous examples of our clients who are doing extremely well in this area. In fact, a couple of days ago, we held a specific webinar around the medical device market. As I mentioned earlier, the Indian government has liberalized its attitude towards foreign retailing. They had allowed single brand retailing for some time, and they now permit 100% investment in a single brand, such as a Levi's. The bottom right is a picture of the Levi's store in Bangalore from a few years ago. But now they permit multi-brand retailing as well. So, and here I'm talking about retailing in a broad sense of any consumer-related interaction. So I want to include franchises, whether it's a Kentucky Fried Chicken or any kind of franchise operation. I want to include the quick service restaurants. All of those are going to find a booming market in India. Some of them have been around for a long time, such as Domino's Pizza. They've been in India for about 20 years now, I think. But there's much more opportunity for American companies to expand in that in this sector if they know how to do this right. People think of India as a provider of services to the United States. We all know about the call centers and the IT activity coming from India to the US. But often what gets unnoticed is that American companies are providing an almost equal amount of services to India. This includes companies that offer engineering services. Bechtel, for example, the largest engineering services company in the world, has done tremendously well in India. They at one time had as many as 3,000 engineers working on one particular refinery project. The signature buildings across India are being built by American architects, and there's a tremendous opportunity in that area. And believe it or not, we have actually helped IT services companies based in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles to be able to offer their services to the Indian ecosystem. There's a demand for high-tech, whether it's software or hardware. There's soon going to be a greater demand for financial services. And just a few weeks ago, the government liberalized telecommunications investment, as I mentioned earlier. So already companies such as Vodafone are doing extremely well in India, but we expect that there's much more opportunity going beyond that. Here in Southern California, where I live, Qualcomm has a huge business in India. But because of the changes that have happened in recent weeks, we think that this is going to grow even bigger. All right, so let me conduct another poll right now, if I may.
And thank you to everyone who's been sending me questions. We will answer them as Gunjan deems necessary. Thanks.
You should see a poll on your screen. I just want to find out a little bit about the extent of the sales activity. We have a fairly large audience today, so I just want to get a sense of the distribution. Do you have any like that?
Yeah, we have Kathy has a compliment for you, first of all, thanking you for your insights, and is then curious to know how you think weakening rupee vis-a-vis the US dollar is going to affect international trade.
Yeah, that's a definite concern. Over the last few months, the rupee has dropped from 45 to the dollar all the way to 60 to the dollar. Much of this reflects the recent policies of the Indian government, and that's really partly why they scrambled to liberalize FDI faster than they had planned originally. The weaker rupee does make it harder for American companies to sell their products in India, but it's mitigated largely by the fact that you have a booming economy. And as long as you have products or services that can justify themselves economically, there is really not a problem in finding a market for them in India. Most successful companies in India today are growing at 15, 20%. We know of many that are growing at 25, 30% per year. And at that kind of growth rate, a slight depreciation of the rupee does not affect companies in most of the sectors that we are talking about. Now, if you are in bulk materials, if you're in, if you're shipping a commodity, then it's definitely a factor. But I would say that there's something we need to watch. I mean, let me make an extreme statement. If the rupee went down to 100 to the dollar, we could still have a very thriving business for American companies. I don't think that's going to happen. But all I'm saying is that the exchange rate alone is not going to limit the business. Now, this doesn't mean that your Indian customers won't complain about it, okay? And we'll get into Indian habits later on, but that's, in terms of a substantial business threat, it's not really holding American companies back. All right, let's see if we can close the poll. For $2 billion, which they shortly doubled to $4 billion. The first of these planes was delivered. That's what you see on the ground in India. It has the Indian flag on the front. The plane has landed, and I guess they planted a flag on the front of it. I live in Cerritos, California, only about 5 miles from Long Beach, California, where they build the C-17, which is a large transport aircraft. And the picture you see on the bottom right is my friend, the Consul General in San Francisco, making a talk at the first C-17 being assembled there in the Long Beach factory. The deliveries for those are supposed to begin very soon. And when the deliveries are done, the Indian Air Force will become the largest operator of the C-17 next to the U.S. Air Force. So it's a very significant piece of business for Boeing and a very significant accomplishment for Indian taxpayers who are creating jobs right here in my neighborhood. The factory, the C-17 factory in Long Beach was supposed to shut down for the local economy here where I live. Okay, so we are going to talk about the 4 Ps of marketing as applied to a business-to-business scenario largely. So first, I want to give you an example of one of our clients. I cannot tell you who it is. The distribution much in terms of sales. And they kept talking about regulations being the problem. So they hired us at first to understand what the regulatory infrastructure for their product was in India and whether that was the barrier. And we found there were some regulatory issues, but nothing that was really holding the sales back. And so then they hired us for the second phase, which was to really examine how a device that accepts currency, the kind of thing that you would see on a candy machine where you can put money in, metro train systems, for example. So we examined how buying behavior in this category happens in India at the government agencies, at the federal and state level, at the quasi-government-owned corporations, many of whom run the metro train systems, for example, and other municipal services that would accept cash. Cash is a much bigger part of the Indian economy than it is of the US economy, so currency acceptance becomes a big deal. And there's considerable counterfeit currency floating around in India, largely coming from across the border. And so there's tremendous concern about being able to validate that the currency is not counterfeit, and being able to count and examine it in many different applications. We also looked at small integrators who are building their own machines or systems which needed the currency acceptor. Our recommendation for this particular client was to actually have a multi-channel approach. A single large distributor, even though it was a large company, was not set up to be able to represent their product effectively. And our recommendation for them was to have a direct team to be able to deal with the big commuter systems orders, because each of those could run into thousands of currency acceptors at a time for them. And typically these would be handled through a tender, and the tender would specify the minimum features required. And if you didn't have a say into what those minimum features were going to be and how our client's product was advantageous in an environment where counterfeiting is a major concern, then they really weren't going to do so well. So it made sense for the company to invest direct effort in this particular area. In addition, rather than this one big distributor that they had, which was a very famous, well-known company, we found for them 2 very specialized distributors. These were small companies for whom our client's business would rapidly become 30 to 40% of their work. So they were guaranteed to get attention, provided they had some initial sales. And each distributor specialized in one of the verticals that we felt were important for the client to get some initial momentum going. So this worked out very well. The distributors' key employees flew to the European and American offices to get trained, and they were able to handle this very effectively. We also recommended one national company that had presence in largely warehouses across the country, so that they could deliver the 1Z, 2Z orders from the system integrators. Now, there was no demand generation effort being put in by this catalog kind of distributor. The idea was that if someone needed the product, that it was available in market and they could often when people come to us at Amritt, these are the three magic words they want, particularly in the B2B. They say, Gunjan, or the folks at Amritt, can you help us select a distributor? A couple of minutes. Sentence, let's select to missed opportunities at the very least. So let's look at that. So one assumption is that, hey, a distributor is the right solution for me. But in many cases, you don't need a distributor. I'll give you two extremely diverse examples. So and these are not clients. Pratt & Whitney, and Pratt & Whitney sells jet engines of all kinds, military and commercial. For their commercial engine business, they actually started with salespeople located in Connecticut who flew out as needed to the Indian Airlines to encourage them to specify a Pratt & Whitney engine on any orders they were placing on Airbus or Boeing or the Embraer or any other company that had a choice of engines to offer. And they found that because these are high-ticket items and long lead items, it makes far more sense to have somebody who deeply understands your product and can sell it from a U.S. base rather than appointing a distributor or agent in India. At the other end is an interesting company that started out in New York as a group dating service. It's kind of like a Match.com, but their focus was in getting people together who wanted to go on a group date. And this little company noticed that most of their activity online was coming from Mumbai and Delhi and Indian cities rather than the US. And they built a substantial business around this. So they chose to actually relocate the entire company to India. Let me talk about another extreme. One of our clients is in the automotive related business. They sell components into the automotive business, and they decided to just hire one OEM salesperson who worked out of his home for 3 years before they expanded the staff. And this guy was able to go in, build a substantial OEM business with 2 or 3 of the largest automotive companies in India, but each of those led to tens of millions of dollars of business. Some clients will find it valuable to have a subsidiary or joint venture in India. I won't dwell on that very much right now. And for some people, you don't need to do anything other than license your technology or your brand. You don't need to sell their revenue, and you are done. So there are many, many ways in which you can do business other than having a distributor. The other faulty assumption is that if you're going to choose a distributor, it seems to imply that it's just one company or one guy. And a country with a population that exceeds all of Europe, with 23 languages in 28 states, is not going to be served well by a single distributor. So that's really the point I'm making on this slide. The copies of the slides will be available to you later, so I'm not going to dwell on every point on the slides. I just want to hit the high points. The third faulty assumption in that statement, when you say select a distributor, is people come to us and say, these are the folks who have contacted us. They came to our trade show booth, or we met them at a trade show in Dubai or Shanghai or Paris, and here's the list of 10 or 12 people. Or some will come and say, well, all this email that comes to our website is largely from India, and among those must be a good distributor. Well, B2B type of companies, that the best distributor partner is unlikely to be among that list, because the most successful and capable and competent companies typically don't have time to be able to approach you in that manner. Now, they are have sold over 300,000 units of this car. Much of the activity is actually exports going out of India into other countries. They found that their factory that makes this is so efficient that they can support European and Latin American and African sales out of this. More recently, they announced the EcoSport, which is a low-cost, configured it to be appropriate for the Indian market. So the features, the configuration takes into account that India is the same country that produces the Tata Nano and has a vibrant competition from Suzuki, which makes cars in India. So they were very conscious of the characteristics of the Indian consumer, and they configured these products so that they would resonate with the Indian consumer, and both have done extremely well. Received more business in July of this year than they ever have in their history in India. So the message I really have is make your products India ready. And another quick example is Dunkin' Donuts. They entered India recently, and very soon they realized that they needed to offer more than just donuts to be successful, and I'm not talking coffee here. So in India, they're called Dunkin' Donuts and more. And at the bottom left, I have a picture of their veggie sandwich, which is one of their big sellers being offered at the stores in Delhi and elsewhere. Let's move quickly to talk about another key element of international sales, which is advertising. And advertising in India seems to run very differently in many ways compared to the West. And here I have one example of that. So Amitabh Bachchan is the equivalent of Tom Cruise and Jude Law and George Clooney put together. He's been a top star in India. Many commercial relationships, and one of them happens to be Tom Cruise in a B2B ad selling cranes or other technology related products to companies. But that's quite mainstream in India. And these are pictures of billboards that have appeared in India. He also does television advertising and print advertising for Binani Cement. You may recognize his face if you saw the Great Gatsby. He was the guy featured as Meyer time in the beginning of the movie. I want to point your attention very briefly to one other ad, which is the one on the top left here. This is explanation. So they're saying that page 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7, page 3 is missing from the list because page 3 in India, like the UK, refers to the page where they have in a British newspaper. That's the page where they're saying is our paper offers a lot more than that. They're also taking a dig at India's largest newspaper, which is called the Times of India. So you see the little slogan at the bottom that says stay ahead of the times. India doesn't generally encourage head-to-head competitive advertising. So they're trying to make these subtle statements against two of their competitors, Midday, which has an active page 3, and Times of India, which is the largest circulating newspaper in the country. Good thing to understand about advertising in India is that you will find absolutely world-class agencies, both subsidiaries of Western leaders, PP, all of those, but also homegrown agencies that truly understand the Indian demographic. Let me dwell for just a moment on pricing. You have to price your product correctly to get a big boost in sales. And Procter & Gamble, when they entered India fairly late compared to others, they found that it made sense for them to sell Pantene and Head and Shoulders shampoo at 6 cents a pack in a single-use sachet, as they are called. In India, 65% of all shampoo sold has been able to build a nice business doing so. Many other companies such as Unilever and a number of their Indian competitors are doing the same thing. Let me quickly talk about the markers of success, but let me begin by talking about the markers for failure. It's very easy to fail in India. I can give you a 30-second lesson in how to fail. And the three key points that I'm mentioning here. One is to have the assumption that all Indians speak English, and that's driven often by the fact that your colleagues at the office may speak fluent English who are from India. Your physician might be from India, and he or she appears to have a reasonable way to speak in English. But the reality is that while many Indians may speak English, they don't necessarily think like Americans. And the cross-cultural translation between the way an American executive says, like the equivalent of a $10, $100 bill, and you'll see just the words 1,000 rupees have to be written in 15 different languages. It's a complex country, and you need to understand that complexity before you deal with it. You can't assume that an Indian American on your staff is going to have all the knowledge needed to deal with India. If they left India as a 20-something-year-old, if they spent a considerable amount of time in the U.S. and they haven't worked in India, they'll be as much of a foreigner as anybody else going to India. Finally, you need to get to India now. You shouldn't be waiting because there's a lot happening today. Starbucks announced its entry into India 3 or 4 times over the last decade, and every time retracted. In the meantime, Cafe Coffee Day, an Indian venture-funded company, has built out 5,000 stores. Starbucks' plan, I think, over the next 5 years is to have 50 stores in India. Now, I think here, within a 10-mile radius of where I am sitting, there are 50 Starbucks stores. So yeah, they'll be successful, but at 50 stores, there'll be a dot on the Starbucks revenue map compared to what they could have been had they not let Cafe Coffee Day and others build such a huge market in India. Markers of success to me are preparation. People want to jump on a plane and go to India. Just last night, I had a conversation with an East Coast executive who was ready to fly to a trade show in India. And after we were done talking, he realized that, essentially we said, if it's a vacation, fine. But if it's business, you need to prepare before you go. Otherwise, you might be wasting your time. India is about as far as you can travel. And so you want to be prepared before you go there. So I would say forget what you learned in China. India is a very different country. And all of the value that you get in dealing with India is in understanding how it is different. It's textured. It's a free market. It does not censor Google, and it doesn't limit the amount of American movies that can play. There are many, many differences, and those are the ones you need to understand. There's no quick money to be made in India, and this is something I can talk about further in the Q&A period. I think we have lots of questions, so I will skip over the next example. There are some resources that you should definitely consult. The US government has some nice services, and we make use of them for our clients as and when appropriate. I recommend lots of reading and preparation. I have a book out on doing business in India. This is not a pitch for the book, but you'll find on Amazon that it is among the most highly recommended books on the subject. If you're going to watch a movie, Slumdog is entertaining, but I'd rather suggest that you watch a movie like Monsoon Wedding, which gives you a sense of the way Indians think. And so let's move on to our questions, Supriya. I'm going to put up one more of our polls just so that the audience can give us a little bit of a sense of their thinking while we start answering questions. And at this point, if the slides don't work, it won't be the end of the world.
Perfect. All right. So we have a question from Michael, who asks, how do you advise American companies regarding corruption in India and how to avoid or deal with it?
So yeah, I think any time you go into Asia or into emerging countries, corruption is a factor. And anytime you go there as an American company, it is clear to all of us on this call who are working for US companies that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which has very specific penalties against performing any of that kind of activity, should also be clear on our minds. So there are some pieces of business that you will not get as a result of this. There's no two ways about it. there are many European companies that aren't subject to those regulations, that aren't subject to those ethics, and they routinely will do things that the US companies won't. There are Russian companies that will do that as well. So that's just something you have to recognize as reality. But the good thing is that Indian customers, whether they are governments or companies or consumers in general, know that when you are dealing with a US company, what you see is what you get. There's no underhand deal. There's no winking and nodding going on. And this actually liberates you from this, these kinds of pressures. So when you go to, when these types of suggestions are being made to you, my strong recommendation is to very simply and assertively, but not aggressively, make a statement that, look, I work for a US company. Our own ethics do not allow us to do this. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prohibits this kind of behavior, so I can't go there. I'm sorry. I will have to walk away even if I don't get the business. If you make that very clear, I think some of that conversation just goes away. And you have to focus on how you can offer superior products and services, how you can stand behind your product, how American quality means something to others that who have purchased your products and services, or your peers' products and services for that matter. And that will hold you well in the long run. Some things may take you a little longer to get done, but overall you'll build a very lasting business. We have found this to be true in many ways for many of our clients across a number of industries. Okay, let me see if I can close this poll here and share the results. Go ahead and ask me the next question.
Sure. We have a question from Steve, who is asking, how does a U.S. firm get its profits out of India?
Okay. So my guess is that Steve's company perhaps has had some experiences in China or other countries in terms of repatriation difficulties. If you had asked me this question prior to 1991, I would have said you have to beg and plead and wait and wait and wait. But today, that's not the factor at all. India has a 20-year record now of liberalization, and the flow of foreign exchange and of profits going back to U.S. companies or foreign companies anywhere is pretty much unimpeded. Now, sure, there's paperwork you have to file. India is a bureaucracy, and there's certainly always paperwork. You want to be sure that your accountants and financial advisors and lawyers have all the ducks lined up in a row. But once that is done, all you have to do is file the right paperwork, and there shouldn't be any issue at all. The biggest example of this was when Warburg Pincus, the private equity firm, had invested in Airtel, and India's largest cellular phone company. They made a huge investment, and the stock went up dramatically, and they decided that it was time to cash out, and they made a single transaction on the Bombay Stock Exchange, which was the largest ever transaction to happen on the Bombay Stock Exchange, when they cashed out some of their shares. And the electronics of the exchange held up to that. They had really no trouble repatriating the funds back to the US either. So it's absolutely possible. It's no longer really a big concern for Western companies. Now, if you don't have your paperwork right, or you didn't set up your company right, or you did something else, that's a problem. That's a different matter. But generally speaking, for our clients, we really don't list repatriation of profits as a top 10 concern in 95% of the cases, I would say. Right. Okay, can everybody see the results of the poll? So a good percentage of the people have never been to India, and then almost an equal percentage have spent 10 to 29 days. My magic number for starting to understand India is having spent 30 days in the last 5 years. If you haven't done that, chances are that either you don't understand India fully, or that India has changed since you last had an inkling of what was going on there. So you have to keep up. The society and the country is changing rapidly. I'll bring up the last poll just to get a sense of what people are taking away from this webinar. I will go ahead with your next question. Yeah.
Sure. We have a question from Stuart, who's asking, the high import taxes, do you find it a big factor in limiting sales within the Indian market?
Yes, that's a good question. So the Indian government has every tax known to man, and they call it with every name imaginable. So there are excise taxes, there are duties, there are cesses, and I can't tell the difference between a cess, a duty, and a tax. They're all ways to increase the price of your product. And so in certain categories, you may start out with a product costing $1 that ends up selling in India for $1.35 or $1.68. And people say, hey, how can I compete with so much being added? Much of that is going to the Indian federal government to run its humongous infrastructure. But what you have to keep in mind is that most of those taxes and duties are also being paid by your Indian competitors who are buying materials, putting together a product, and then they have to pay the excise duty and the sales tax and the value-added tax and all the other names that they have. The import duty portion is generally a fairly small percentage of the overall pie. In some categories, it's much larger than others, and the import duty depends on what your product is and how it's going to be used. So if you're selling a particular device, say a measurement device, and it's going to be used in a hospital, maybe the import duty is 0. But if it's going to be sold into a lab that is not a hospital, a non-medical application, maybe the duty is 10 or 15 or 18%. In some cases, they have extremely high duties because they want to discourage the imports in that area. That's generally much better today than it used to be when India began its liberalization. So you have to understand how the duty is structured, and sometimes it makes sense to move part of your manufacturing to India to be able to get lower duties. Maybe the final assembly, maybe the packaging, maybe you have some degree of local sourcing, and that can reduce your overall price. But these are decisions made by individual companies with individual product categories, and generally duties are not what hold Western companies back from success. They're given a lot more blame than they need to be, in my view. We've also had some success in convincing the Indian government to change the duty structure. Now, this is not for somebody who wants instant success. It'll take a few years before that will happen. And obviously, you have to appeal to the self-interest of the Indian people and the self-interest of the Indian government rather than how it's going to make your life as an American or Western company better. And we've been able to do that successfully in a number of cases where we show that there is no threat to the Indian economy by doing this, how Indian consumers or Indian companies or Indian society at large would benefit, and how perhaps exports from India might go up. So we have to make a credible case, and there are very smart people that we have to talk to, and we also have to talk to a number of them and be patient about it. But it's absolutely possible to do that. So duties, I think, are an important factor, and you want to look at it in the right manner. But I would say that if you were to talk to your counterparts in India and look at the way that the US has duties and so on, you would probably find a much more complicated world out there. So it's not something that to us is a significant barrier. It's definitely something to consider, however. Go ahead, Supriya. Okay. Let me close the final poll and share the results here. So people are challenged by pricing and then by product configuration, and the other factors are somewhat lower, but we have a fairly wide distribution. Okay, great. Alrighty, Supriya, do we have more questions? Yes, we actually have a bunch, so we'll try and get through to as many as we can. Otherwise, Gunjan will be sending you emails specifically answering your questions. We have a question from John asking how strong is IP protection in media, movies and television? Yeah, so let me first, for the benefit of the audience at large, answer the broader question about IP protection in India. India was a founding member of the World Trade Organization and committed, therefore, to modifying its IP laws to comply with the so-called TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. All of that work has been done several years ago. There have been numerous situations where the laws have been tested. And in one celebrated case, the Time magazine won punitive damages against a small Indian magazine that had a red border and had the word time in its title. That was the first time punitive damages had been awarded, against an Indian company. So the legal mechanism and infrastructure is there. One place where it does not work well is the movie business. Now, India is the largest producer of filmed entertainment, Bollywood, Tollywood, and the other movie centers in India, in Mumbai, Chennai, Hyderabad, and Calcutta, produce far more movies than Hollywood does. Those movies are ripped off and sold illegally in DVDs and downloadable from websites almost before they're even released commercially in India. The same kind of thing happens to Hollywood movies and music and so on. This is, however, being committed by small groups of individuals rather than in an orchestrated manner by large companies, and certainly there's no government involvement in this kind of piracy. It's extremely retail and low-key as opposed to what you might experience in China, where many of the DVD manufacturing facilities are actually owned by provincial or city governments. This is not to minimize the issue. This is certainly a factor, and the way we see it being overcome over time is through the services relating to real-time streaming, relating to access through alternate devices, and through a very rapid release and marketing build-up, much as we see in this country. So it is a factor, but it is not a factor that puts American companies at a significant disadvantage compared to their Indian peers. And so you will see that the Walt Disney Company, Warner Brothers, Fox, and Viacom are all fairly active in India now. It's too big a market for them to ignore, and they're working as best as they can to be able to deal with the issues of piracy. Now, around music, I would also add that laws in India are somewhat different from the US. So copyright protection for songs is structured differently, and the ability to remix a song and produce something based on a derivative work, the laws are somewhat different. So if you're in the music business, you have to understand that what you're used to in the US may not apply exactly the same in India. Yes, what else do we have? So Priya, I can stay on for a few more minutes in case there are many questions.
Yeah, we do have
we are over the official time limit, so maybe you want to let people who want to leave tell them about the survey as they leave and so on, and then I'll stay on.
Sure. And we had some specific questions relating to healthcare, B2B, very very specific questions on certain industries, and Gunjan will respond to you personally via email. I just wanted to thank everybody for attending the webinar today, and we hope it was informative. If you have any additional questions, please continue to send them to us by email at usa@amritt.com. Please make sure as you're exiting the webinar that you complete a brief survey that is presented to you. We would really appreciate your feedback. If you have any friends or colleagues who you might think benefit from a similar webinar, please do have them register on our website, www.amritt.com, and we will notify them of any upcoming webinars. I would like to thank all of you for attending today. Have a nice day, and for those who want to continue to remain online, we will continue to answer the questions that you have sent to us. Thank you. Gunjan, so the next question we have is how does an average Indian consumer think when it comes to buying and spending on foreign goods and services?
To answer that question literally is pretty challenging, because India is a composite of many, many sub-societies. So it's hard really to have a single answer to what the average Indian consumer thinks. I would much rather answer the question of how does a consumer who's likely to buy your particular product think? Okay, you can segment the Indian market by urban versus rural. You can segment them by the socioeconomic status. You can segment them by religion, by traditional versus modern. There's so many different psychographic and demographic dimensions that you can segment them by. Out of 1.2 billion people in India, chances are that your product, and unless it happens to be toothpaste or laundry detergent, is going to appeal to a fairly small sliver of that 1.2 billion people. But when you get to that sliver, you may still find 50 million people in that sliver. And so the question really becomes is, how does that group of people think? But let me talk about how people who buy foreign-made products or foreign-branded products may approach the foreignness of the products, if you will. So when I was growing up in India, it was a protected society, and you really couldn't get much imported product legally into the country. It was a long British heritage, and my parents grew up believing that anything British was automatically better than anything Indian. And you would see a few American products. Maybe you'd see a few old Chevrolets that you'd see some Johnson & Johnson baby powder, which was the only baby powder my mother ever used. But generally speaking, you didn't see very many American brands in India until liberalization began in 1991. Since then, many brands, both in the consumers in India, GE makes billions of dollars. You've seen the success that Boeing has had. And most Americans, most Indians, when they think of Western society, generally tend to relate to American values. They aspire to visit Disneyland. They aspire to, they understand American celebrities. One of the pictures I showed, which I didn't comment on, was when Daniel Day-Lewis won the award, Oscar for Lincoln, and billboards went across the country congratulating him. Because not that every Indian would have watched Lincoln, but they certainly understood that it was an important movie, and they understood that Daniel Day-Lewis had done a really good job of portraying Lincoln. So there is an affinity towards American culture. People know who Lady Gaga is. People know who Britney Spears is. People aspire to the American lifestyle. When new condo communities are being built in India, they have names such as Malibu and Palm Springs, even though many of the people who will buy those flats, as they are called, or condominiums, will never visit Southern California. But the pictures that you see are representing those communities often represent the Southern California culture, which I chuckle about since I've lived in Southern California now for 2 decades, and it's interesting to see that that lifestyle being portrayed in India. There's a community where one of our colleagues, Purnima, lives in Bangalore, called Palm Meadows, and they, most Indian bungalows or single-family homes have flat roofs, but they built this particular community with sloping roofs, even though it doesn't snow in India, because the designers of the community felt that they would get a premium if that particular housing community looked very much like an American suburb. And I think the last time I checked with her, the price of her house was about 20 times what she and her husband paid for it 10 years ago. So it has absolutely worked out for both the developers and the owners. So yeah, if you're thinking about the way Indian consumers think, that's the kind of segment that you need to isolate and work with. Do we have more questions? I can probably stay on for another minute or two.
Yeah, we still have a lot of questions. Thank you for being such an active audience today. We have a question from Connor, which is about pricing. We are pricing at a rate of 10 cents on the dollar. Is this too low now that the economy is improving? It is a competency.
I assume.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
There's a comment that it's a competency assessment service that an Indian assessment company distributes.
I see. So I imagine this is a service being offered to consumers rather than to companies. And you really have to look at the size of the wallet. I'm not sure what he means by the economy is improving. The Indian economy did not blip for long after the 2008 Great Recession here in the US. But the Indian wallets are substantially smaller than US wallets. And if you want to charge the same price for a service, you will find very few takers. So you really have to gauge it not by the cost of your service in the US, but by what percentage of somebody's income would they spend on a service like that, and price it accordingly. If it works out to 10 cents on the dollar for you, maybe that is the right place for you. I would definitely take a look at the pricing and see whether you can test something higher. You may have to emphasize the value a little bit more. You may have to emphasize how it benefits the Indian buyer of the service, and that benefit pattern may be very different from what you see in the US. So that's one of the factors that many American companies don't fully appreciate when they go to India, and they tend to emphasize the same benefit package that works for American consumers. And maybe that doesn't resonate as well, but there's some other factor that does. And that, if you can isolate that, and if you can emphasize that and perhaps build upon it, and maybe you can have 3 versions of your service, and a couple of them can start to approach closer to your American rates. And this is something we'd be happy to talk about more on a one-to-one conversation. We have many, many examples of having done that for our clients.
Great, thanks, Gunjan. We have a question from Stuart, who is asking how much has spending increased within the medical industry in the past 5 years, and what is the projected expenditure for capital equipment over the next 5 to 10 years, and what are the subspecialties that have seen the biggest growth, for example, ophthalmology, ENT, GYN, etc.
So we held a specific webinar on the medical device sector just a couple of days ago, and we have some research papers on that subject. And Stuart, if you send us an email, we'll give you more detail on that. But I know that there's a number of pharma and medical device people on this webinar as well, so let me try and address that. At the high end, the Indian hospitals, the top 100 Indian hospitals are doing extremely well. They perform world-class work. They've been featured in studies by the Mayo Clinic and the Harvard Business School, and they are offering services at world-class quality for substantially lower prices. They do this not just because the cost of labor is lower, but the fact that they use their capital far more intensively than we do in the US. So they may have a machine that runs 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, whereas the same piece of equipment may only run 6 to 7 hours a day, 4.5 days a week in the US. If you are selling any kind of medical device or equipment that can apply to India, regardless of the specialty, you're going to find a potentially huge market in India. One of our clients was in the business of selling used medical equipment, and his company would buy stuff coming off of lease and refurbish it, make it functional, and then ship it over to India. And they found that the second-tier hospitals in India just lapped up their product. So we've had direct experience across many, many sectors, because these guys could really offer any piece of equipment that could be sold in this manner. Some of our clients obviously are the primary, mid to large-sized medical device companies, and they have done extremely well in India. I think they're still skimming the surface right now, because capital expenditure by the Indian government is going to double. The increasing middle class and the ability to have third-party payment is going to cause tremendous growth in the medical device business. Currently, we estimate that the size of the medical device market in India is somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion. But there are many projections that say that it could grow to 20 or 25 billion within a few years. It's hard to get solid numbers on this, and it's possible that the projections may be understated. I think over the next couple of years, the Indian government is going to release its own regulations around medical devices. Right now, there's only 22 products that are listed in the Indian regulations, and most of the rest are regulated like drugs. So there's really virtually no proper regulation set up, and that has held back some Western companies from entering. But we feel that all of this is on the brink of a radical change, and so you should be lining up to take advantage of that change.
Great, thank you.
I think we should probably stop at this point because it's getting to be about 15 minutes after the hour. I will take all the other questions that have appeared on the question box, and over the next week or so, provide individual answers where possible. And if some of them apply to the audience at large, we may send them as mail to those who had attended the conference.
Great. Thank you so much, Gunjan, for staying beyond and answering as many questions as you could. Again, if there were any questions that were unanswered, we will definitely follow up with the answers. And if you have any questions that may have come up as a part of the discussions, you can send them to us at usa@amritt.com, and we will get back to you with our answers. Thank you again, everyone, for attending today, and have a nice day. Goodbye.